and that was to ask her if she would agree to Parliament's clock tower to be renamed the Elizabeth Tower to mark the Diamond Jubilee 10 years ago. I was truly honoured when she accepted. That name was formally changed, and we now have a constant parliamentary landmark honouring Her Majesty. As we now mourn the person we knew, we should reflect the constant is also the monarchy itself, the British monarchy that has matured over centuries and allowed our great country to advance, to mature, to thrive as a democracy. Her loss does, of course, leave a mark, the end of an era. But in our new king, who is well prepared to serve, the monarchy will continue to play its role in how our state functions. So yes, we do mourn the loss of our Queen, but we also transfer our faith, our allegiance to our new King, His Majesty Charles III. Long live the King.
Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to colleagues across the House for their moving words today. Like other members, I have found the outpouring of affection from both our shores and across the world for our Queen deeply heartwarming. I hope the royal family finds solace in this over the coming days and weeks. I have always taken great inspiration from our Queen. She was a woman who found herself in a position of leadership at such a young age, a woman who threw herself into service as not just the most recognisable, but also the most admired of global leaders. A woman who steered those of us through loved times of joy, darkness, and always drawing on her own experience and inner strength to help those that most need it. And I'm in awe of the way she took on this unimaginable responsibility. She got on with the job. She never stopped, and she has set an example for all of us. One of the most proudest moments of my life, and also for my family, was when I was sworn into the Privy Council. These kind of things don't happen to a girl like me. It was surreal to meet Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II herself via Zoom. She could put anyone at ease, adapting to the challenges and the circumstances and the change. Most of all, though, she was a loving grandmother, and for me as a grandmother myself, I know and understand the complete love that she had for her family. Her children and her grandchildren were the centre of her life, and I know the whole house shares in both their pain and their pride. To us, she was our Queen, our national figurehead, and the greatest and longest-serving monarch in British history. To them, she was also Granny. The loss of such a loving presence will be heartbreaking, and my heart goes out to them. Her Majesty the late Queen was a constant figure of strength, integrity and service throughout our lives. She was an inspiration to women across the world, with complete devotion to her duty, her family and her country. She set an example of leadership for women everywhere. The outpouring of condolences from leaders across the world is testament to that. More recently, we will never forget how she guided us through the despair and loneliness of the pandemic, and her values of public service and dignity never wavered. It is appropriate today that I speak from the backbenchers because our Queen was greatly loved and admired by the people of my constituency. She visited Greater Manchester many times and was always welcomed with love by the local community. And she was last in Manchester a year ago to visit Coronation Street, where the cast greeted her at the Rovers Return pub to celebrate the show's 60th anniversary. And it's just 3 months since the streets of Ashton, Drawson and Failsworth were decked with Union Jack flags as we came together to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee. Our local papers were proud and our local community was proud. She's now gone, but she will be forever missed and always in our hearts. May she rest in peace. God save the King.
Yeah. Alex Chalk. Speaker, and I pay tribute to the extraordinarily warm and moving tribute just paid by the Honourable Lady, Right Honourable Lady. Queen Elizabeth II famously referred to her late husband as her strength and stay, but although she would never have claimed it for herself, it was she who was the strength and stay of an entire nation, and indeed the Commonwealth. The constancy and humble commitment to duty were the hallmarks of her life. She embodied values that are the best of our country. In a world of increasing noise and self-promotion, she provided that counterpoint of quiet poise and dignity. We in Cheltenham are proud of a lifetime's connection with Queen Elizabeth II. It was as a young princess that she came to our town. She gave her name to Princess Elizabeth Way, which remains a major Cheltenham thoroughfare, and she did so by planting an oak tree in 1951 to mark its completion. Later that same year, she was at the races, the Cheltenham Gold Cup, with her mother. Now,
Ligi, unakubali kwamba Joti ni noma?
which then decorated the front of the municipal offices. She recalled a recent media story about a hanging basket landing on someone's head elsewhere. She noted that Cheltenham's display was so magnificent it could wipe out the entire council. Like many people, I sat down with my children yesterday, aged 10 and 8, and I tried to convey the scale of what had happened. Children cannot and probably should not bear as we do the aching pain of this loss. But as we mourn, let us explain to them what Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II meant to this nation. Just as Her Majesty the Queen dedicated herself to the service of our country in 1952, let us dedicate ourselves to immortalising her values: duty, integrity, selflessness, country and kindness. As a woman of faith, I hope she will have approached the end with peace. And yesterday, as her death was announced, I thought of her family and those who were close by as, in the words of a young RAF pilot in 1941, she slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. God save the King.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. On behalf of my constituents, I rise to pay tribute to Her Majesty the Queen. We mourn the passing of an icon. She was admired across the world and touched our lives in so many positive ways. The Queen was a constant example of service, of duty, of wisdom, of dedication to her people, her country and the Commonwealth. These were her civic virtues, needed now more than ever. She began her life of service as a child and worked until the final days of her life. The tone was set during World War II when the then King and Queen chose to stay in London during the Blitz, and the young Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Army. When their home, Buckingham Palace, was bombed, the Queen Mother famously said that she could now look the East End in the face. Ever since then, EastEnders have embraced the Queen and her family with a particular bond of love and loyalty. Of course, today's East End is a very different place, more diverse and more connected to the rest of the world, and in particular the Commonwealth countries. Her Majesty reimagined Britain's post-colonial place in the world, and the Commonwealth has grown to 54 nations with nearly 2.5 billion people. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can personally relate to the story of the Commonwealth as a child born in a Commonwealth country, Bangladesh, which joined in 1972. And I remember in 1983 watching with pride the Queen visiting that very new country with Prince Philip. It was a state visit and a big moment for a new nation. And it was a time and a moment that made us feel proud to be British, made us feel we belonged not only to this country, but also to the Commonwealth family. And across the Commonwealth, people are remembering when the Queen came to town with a great sense of warmth and affection. And here at home, in my constituency, I had the honour of receiving the Queen during the Royal London Hospital visit when the new facilities were opened. The hospital that was at the heart of our national life and at the epicentre of coping with the pandemic. The Queen's words during the pandemic was so necessary to give hope and comfort when constituencies like mine were hit so hard. And others have mentioned the Olympic ceremony, when one of the highlights was when it seemed that Her Majesty and her most loyal servant James Bond were parachuting into the Olympic Stadium in London's East End. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we pride ourselves in being the coolest part of the country. Her Majesty made us the coolest place on earth with that stunt. On behalf of my constituents, our thoughts are with her children, her grandchildren, her wider family, and her heir and successor, His Majesty King Charles III. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty was unique. She radiated warmth. She embodied decency. We will never see her like again. We will never know such a paragon of civic virtue and a shining beacon of public service. May she rest in peace. Long live the King.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the excellent speech from the Honourable Lady for Bethnal Green and Bow. I rise on behalf of all of my constituents in Preseli, Pembrokeshire, to convey our condolences to His Majesty King Charles III and all members of the royal family at this sad time, and to say thank you for a wonderful, long and full life and an extraordinary reign that's been a blessing to our nation for 7 decades. Queen Elizabeth II was loved and respected all across the historic county of Pembrokeshire, where her family, of course, had ancestral roots through the Tudor line. And we enjoyed her visits to Pembrokeshire, to St David's Cathedral, or to visit so many of the excellent charities and community groups that we have in the constituency. For millions of adults, and certainly for children, certainly when we meet them in constituency school visits, Queen Elizabeth absolutely had something of that mystique and magic that we perhaps associate with an earlier Queen Elizabeth or with a Disney fairy tale queen. But her reign was also an extraordinarily human and personal reign, as we've been hearing so often today, shaped as it was by her amazing capacity to touch people at a very individual level, to raise their self-esteem, to touch their hearts in a very, very special way that left lasting lifetime memories. And for now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that joy that she gave to the nation, to people in all of our constituencies that she met, for now that joy gives way to grief and sadness. In time we will remember the reign with joy once again, but in the meantime we ask God to bless her and to save King.
Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to speak in tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. I would firstly like to begin by expressing my most sincere condolences to her family on my own behalf and on behalf of the people across the constituency of Llanelli. Our thoughts are particularly with the King, Charles III, her other children, her grandchildren, their families. For them this is a deeply personal loss. And whilst they've always had to share the Queen, their mother and grandmother, with the public, that is particularly hard at this time of immense grief. And for them too, this follows so close on the loss of their father and grandfather, the late Prince Philip. I would like to set on record my huge appreciation for the way the Queen carried out her duties, shouldering an enormous workload and responsibility from a young age for a full 70 years, including working right into this week, appointing the new Prime Minister. The Queen was absolutely exemplary in her dedication and commitment, an example to all of us in public life. But she went above and beyond that, taking a personal interest in matters and showing real empathy with people. And in Wales, we were very privileged to receive her visits on many occasions, and she's been with us for important moments in our nation's history, opening the National Assembly for Wales in 1999, and last year opening the 6th session of the Senedd. In relation to that visit, I would like to tell you about a young woman, Fiona Gwydder, from my constituency, who at the opening of the Senedd was tasked with presenting Her Majesty with a bouquet of flowers. But as you can imagine, as that moment approached, she was very, very nervous. But she need not have worried. The Queen looked at her and immediately understood the situation and put her at ease, asking her gently, "Are those flowers for me? How beautiful. They match my outfit." That's a moment that Fiona will never forget, and is just one of countless examples of how the Queen was always so kind and thoughtful in her approach and knew exactly how to handle the occasion and put a young woman at ease. And during her reign, she would have touched millions in the same way. But it's not only on happy occasions that the Queen has visited Wales. She will always be remembered for her visit to Aberfan in the aftermath of the terrible tragedy of 1966, when a slag heap buried the school. This has been put on record by Jeff Edwards, the last child to be rescued from the school. Speaking about her visit, he stressed the community's appreciation, saying that people felt comfort from the fact the Queen, who was head of state, had come to a small mining village and had shown direct interest and concern for her subjects who had gone through this enormous event. But the Queen's role goes far beyond Wales and beyond the UK to the Commonwealth. There we have seen huge changes, a complex transition from the Empire to today's Commonwealth. With such a range of nations, each with its own particular circumstances, it is no wonder that sometimes tensions have arisen. And we must recognise the crucial role that the Queen has played in maintaining what is a unique family of nations. There is no doubt that her wisdom and professionalism, her personal rapport with individuals, and the very high esteem in which she is held have been pivotal in helping to smooth that transition and keeping the Commonwealth together. And now, Mr Deputy Speaker, going forward, the best tribute that we can give is to follow her excellent example and to try and serve our communities with the same dedication and fortitude that she showed throughout her life. So as we turn to the future, long live the King.
Yeah. Robin Walker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As someone with the honour of representing the faithful city of Worcester, I want to pass on the love, prayers and good wishes of constituents, faith and civic leaders to all the royal family, and especially His Majesty the King at this sad and historic moment. I can associate myself with so many of the superlatives we have heard from across the House today, but I want to focus on two things. Her Majesty's faith and her profound connection, as the Honourable Lady who just spoke was speaking about, with children. Her late Majesty swore at her coronation to be a defender of the faith, and in so many messages over the decades, she not only defended, but enhanced and gently protected the role of faith in our society, not only for her own Church of England, but as we've heard from people of all faiths and denominations, for people across the whole of the United Kingdom of all faiths and none. When Princess Elizabeth first visited Worcester in 1951, she was already the mother of two small children, and the beautiful princess was greeted by flower girls and a parade of scouts and guides outside the cathedral. As a lifelong patron of the guides and former girl guide herself, as well as the fount of so many Queen's Scout Awards, she has inspired millions of young people. She returned as Queen in 1957 and visited New Road, the most beautiful cricket ground in England, with her consort Prince Philip, touring the boundary in an open-top Land Rover to the cheers of 5,000 local schoolchildren. After more visits in the 1980s, when she distributed Maundy money and celebrated the anniversary of the city's charter, her final visit to Worcester, and the proudest moment of my life, was at her Diamond Jubilee. Her Majesty opened the Hive Library, a joint city and university library, which is the first of its kind in Europe and a fabulous repository of children's books. And I was fortunate enough to be among the welcoming party on that visit, to join some volunteers from local charities and children from local schools at the event and being presented to Her Majesty the Queen. And what struck me, as so many have already reported, was her smile, her bright, humorous eyes, her genuine interest in the people to whom she was introduced, and the instant connection she formed with the children. Most recently, children in schools up and down our country were able to celebrate and learn about Her Majesty at the remarkable Platinum Jubilee, and they joined children in successive generations in singing, dancing and making wonderful art to celebrate a jubilee of this longest-serving sovereign. She was described by one of our former Prime Ministers as a matriarch, and of course that is right. But I think we've also lost the world's favourite granny. I would join with my right honourable friend for Pendle and with Paddington there in simply saying on behalf of us all, thank you, Ma'am, for everything.
Wyn Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm here to offer my the condolences of the has always been there, a steadfast figure in our shared history, With quiet dignity, she made her mark in momentous global events, but perhaps more importantly, she touched people in a very personal way. Across these aisles, the Queen is part of the backdrop of the stories of all of our lives. The Queen brought grace, warmth, dignity and humour to a role which in turn brought respect from people across political divides, and her passing brings an unsettling time, a time of grief and reflection, and for many a reminder of loved ones lost. People across the nations may feel understandably they've lost a loved one of their own, yet already preparations are underway and the duty occupies the new King Charles III, showing in the immortal words of Terry Pratchett that truly the only thing known to travel faster than ordinary light is indeed monarchy. But regardless of our views on monarchy, the Queen is respected for her remarkable dignity with which she held herself throughout trying times, and we appreciate the twinkle in her eye, her humour, her love of animals, and the humility with which she held far from humble office. She was the first Queen Elizabeth in Scotland, of course, with lineage stretching back to the Stuart dynasty and Mary Queen of Scots. And in Scotland, hosting barbecues in the hills of Balmoral, it said that was where she was happiest. Older generations will fondly remember the royal tour of Midlothian back in 1961, where she was out and about across the county, viewing aspects of everyday life and visiting in Roslin Chapel or the rural housing schemes at Temple, the carpet factory in Bonnyrigg and to the Lonehead Memorial Park. There was no standing room left in the streets of Dalkeith at this time, with crowds climbing on the roof of the bus station seeking a glimpse of the young Queen. And more recently, she was warmly welcomed back to Midlothian for the reopening of the Borders Railway, unveiling a plaque at the station in Newton Grange, where she was welcomed with a wonderful performance by the Newton Grange Silver Band, who expressed their condolences at this time. People from all walks of life in Midlothian wish to convey their respects and make it clear just how fondly the Queen is remembered. Condolences have been expressed online by community groups across Midlothian, in addition to Midlothian's Lord Lieutenant and Provost, who have already held local tributes, and in line with many other places have opened up Book of Condolence across council venues in Midlothian to allow people to pay their own tributes. And Mr Deputy Speaker, as a previous member and the current chair of the All-Party Group for the Boys Brigade, I've always been keenly aware of Her Majesty's role as the organisation's patron, and know that all in the Boys Brigade world wish to pass on their thoughts and prayers of the entire Boys Brigade family at this time. We're all now getting our heads round the changes that this will make to the basic things that we all took for granted. The ground has shifted beneath our feet, and the lads at my local post office in Lonehead said, "Every day we send hundreds of letters and parcels bearing the Queen's head, and this will now be no more. May she rest in peace."
Andrew Morrison.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise with the deep and profound condolences of my constituents in South West Wiltshire. A good and gracious lady has been taken from us, and we're all the poorer for that. A lady who has shaped the contours of our national life for 70 years has gone, but her legacy endures. And if you doubt that, just see the pictures of His Majesty in the hour of his grief, greeting the crowds that have gathered outside Buckingham Palace today. Mr Deputy Speaker, grown men don't cry, do they? Well, they do. And I've cried twice in my adult life, once when my father died, and once last night, for a woman that I had only met once at the aforementioned gin and tonic opportunity that a number of right honourable members have cited today. But unfortunately, in my case, there was no gin and tonic. And the reason it is so profound for most of us is for most of our lives, all of our lives, she has been a constant, somebody who has always been there, a rock, a stable place, someone to look to and to admire. And like many colleagues around the House today, when I go to primary schools, I'm asked two questions usually, one more difficult to answer than the other. Have you met the Queen, and how much are you paid? Last night I called my mother because I knew she'd be upset, and she was. In June 1953, she, like many of her generation, lined the streets of London to watch another young woman go to her coronation. That was a profound moment for her and an extraordinary moment in the life of our nation. And very soon we will do something again under altogether more sombre circumstances. But her sense of profound loss is certainly replicated right across this land and by people of all generations. And if I can say particularly, since I remain a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, by the armed forces of this country who have lost their Commander-in-Chief, many of whom live in the towns and villages around Salisbury Plain that I have the honour and privilege to represent. Now, in 878, Alfred the Great secured the future of what became Wessex and ultimately the nation-state we know today. The Great is a descriptor that should not be used lightly. Queen Elizabeth II is the benchmark for monarchs in this age and ages past. She is Elizabeth the Great. As the Elizabethan age closes and the Caroline era dawns, we have to understand that it will look and feel different. We will look and feel different. But difference will bring renewal, and it will bring opportunity, as His Majesty has demonstrated today. Rest well, Your Majesty. God save the King.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a privilege to offer the condolences of my constituents to His Majesty the King and indeed to all members of the royal family. My constituency is privileged to be able to thank Her late Majesty and indeed, at the time, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, now of course the King, for securing Sony being developed in my constituency. As the Managing Director of Sony UK told me today, thousands of my constituents have benefited from the direct intervention of Her Majesty and indeed now His Majesty. The site was opened by the late Queen in 1993, and it was in fact the King in 1974 on a visit to Japan who said to the then Chief Executive of Sony, if you consider putting something in the UK, please put something in my country, Wales. I think of Her late Majesty in the forms of fun and friendship. And just like the member for South West Wiltshire, I'm frequently asked whenever I go to a school visit, be they teenagers or primary schools, have you ever met the Queen? To which the answer is, sort of. I've seen her. I've been at the box in the Lords for the Queen's speech. I once was asked, following the question, have you ever touched the Queen? I'm not sure who was more shocked, me or the head teacher, who genuinely looked like he was about to faint. The Queen had a healthy obsession with trees.
One, I think...
And I can recall fondly the talks,
pretty tricky area for both of them for the weeks after morning. The Prime Minister has announced an end to the ban on fracking. It is literally inconceivable that the new King Charles regards fracking as a good policy.
Not see that tree come to its 50 year.
Well, we will pick that up as we go along, but for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, obviously we've seen today the new King's very first walkabout with his wife, the Queen Consort, still getting used to saying these things, still relatively new, but there we are, the new King and the new Queen Consort moving about outside Buckingham Palace, saying hello to people, and people will have been very, very pleased to see that. Simon and Anna, maybe Simon, I can start with you, watching this. New King, new dawn, new day. What are the things he's got to worry about? I think we can probably all agree, heard it from many...
My common touch is what he has picked up from the late Queen, and I know he will go on to serve this country well. And I think that common touch is what God bless and keep the Queen and all. And I know he will go on to God serve this country well.
I'd like to thank Chris Elmore for keeping well within the 3-minute limit. So please, could people look at their contributions, keep them as short as you can, because we want to get as many in as we possibly can. I'd like to thank Chris Elmore for keeping well within the 3-minute limit. So please, could people look at their
There has been so many wonderful, moving tributes today. It's been a real pleasure to be in the chamber to listen to them all. And with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make my tribute through the eyes of the school children of Tatton. For so many MPs have mentioned here today, the curiosity and with your permission of the late Queen Elizabeth II. And the question they do ask, particularly in primary school and junior school, is, have you met the Queen? And when I say yes, there are literally squeals of delight, gasps of disbelief, uncontainable excitement ripple through the class. Such was the impact that this lady had on all the people of this country, of all ages and of all parts of the country. She loved children, and children loved her. And the clatter of questions that followed. Were you nervous when you met her? How was she? What's she like? Where did you meet her? So I try and describe the Queen to them as they sit and listen, eyes wide open. Well, I say she's diminutive, or she was diminutive, yet she was imposing. She was gentle, yet steely, and that powder puff grey hair, she was radiant and she shone. But it was her eyes that were remarkable and memorable. They were penetrating and bottomless, the knowledge behind them limitless. You can almost feel what she had seen and what she had experienced. You were in the presence of wisdom, and they are kind too. She was a curious blend, quite disarming, and yet incredibly caring. And was I nervous? Without doubt. You're in the presence of greatness, whose life has spanned war and peace. And that nervousness is amplified by the royal protocol, which she lives through and by. So when you're made a Privy Councillor and you've got steps to take, kneels to bow, it's meticulous choreography, the timing, quick steps, kneels, precision of words, and taking oaths. And the seal of office too at Sandringham. It was magical, it was a whirl of rooms and doors opening.
Mary, does the role of Camilla's family change here?
But intensity.
I mean, she had a life before she married Charles, the future king.
And all I can say, it
what
was
happens to
thoughtful,
all of the
but
people in her
simple,
family
no
in her
frills.
orbit?
I think it was nutritionally
There
balanced. There was no fuss whatsoever. It was all bother and nonsense. And as Deputy Chief Whip, I was also treasurer to Her Majesty's household.
Her kids
but what she
and their
did
wives
love,
meet,
and where I met her and spent more time with, the was at Windsor Castle
all
with
that
her
is to come.
horses
But
her stables,
it is true that
she
Prince Charles spends quite a
loved.
lot of
And
time
she confided that one of her
with
best
kids
memories was the day that Estimate won the Ascot
and so
Gold
it's going to be
Cup at
kind of
Royal
a
Ascot,
super modern
trained by Sir
world.
Michael
A little bit messy,
Stout.
sometimes
and she
a
spoke
whole
to
lot
her
messy.
trainers without fail,
and part of the reason that so many people are fascinated by
was what she loved. So I'm absolutely
because on one hand, they're like no one else in the world. They're like they get their job just by get their job, and on the other hand, they're like everybody else. Divorces, spat, divorces, weird, Christmas parties, uncomfortable. So stay tuned. So
I only have great Christmas parties, but that's just me. So Mary, I'm so curious about though that other part of the messy family life, that other part of the messy family life, and how the public eye, and how it seems like the public eye couldn't be hungrier. It seems like the public eye already so hungry for information about his two brothers, about their wives, about his two brothers. What changes in terms of their relationship and their role here as they watch their father take the throne?
I think that they can do themselves a big favor. They can do themselves a big favor. How they stand together. There'll be a lot of eyes on these. There'll be a lot of eyes in the days to come. There's different ceremonies. In the days it'll be noted. If they're smiling, it'll be close there together. In the British press, there has been a lot of negativity about Meghan. A lot of negativity by many people, not all, but by many people as being a person who by many people put a wedge between the boys,
and she became
as they say, who were so close, we're so close. Prince Charles has got to step up here and really kind of command that the family kind of stick together and put on a good face. Who wants two brothers who've been through so much, including losing their mother so horribly and when they were so young? So I think Charles, who is really relishes the role of father and grandfather,
that will be one of the big things that he's going to do here, and everyone's going to be watching. I think Meghan and Kate, noticeably not there in Balmoral when she died. Many people think that Kate was asked not to go because it made it look better when Meghan wasn't. So that news about, oh no, Meghan's the only one out, didn't dominate when the Queen was dying. So probably you'll see a little bit of hangback from Kate and Meghan. But you know who's going to steal the show are the little kids. They're unbelievably adorable, and that they're, you know, all the cameras, you know, it's almost like a magnet that they're going to be going to little George and Charlotte.
And we'll see, of course, whether Harry and Meghan's kids come on the scene in the coming days as well. So, Sarah, I'd like to go back to you for more on this relationship and this question of whether or not King Charles can sort of control his family in some way. And it's sort of old-fashioned to think of the patriarch or the family leader demanding a certain decorum or action from his children. But what is the power or role of Charles to work with his children right now and his children's spouses to come together and show unity at this moment?
Well, I think right now he has quite a lot on his plate. He could do without any family feuds to be dealing with as well. But I think we've shown Prince Charles as he was, King Charles now, displaying quite a firm hand when it has come to family matters of late. And also Prince William, his son. The Queen, it's always been said that Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was her favourite son. And when it was the service of remembrance for Prince Philip, the Duke of York then took his mother by the arm and walked her in. That was seen as hugely controversial given the scandal that has surrounded him. But we were led to believe that that was a decision taken by his mother, that this was a family event. When it came to the Garter ceremony, which is a big, very traditional, old order ceremony that takes place in Windsor, the Duke of York wanted to attend, and he wanted to attend in his full Garter robes. And he was told in no uncertain terms by the Prince of Wales and by Prince William that that was not to happen, that that would not be okay. And I think discussions will certainly have been going on in the weeks leading up to the death of the Queen. We know that Charles had been visiting his mother on a daily basis at Balmoral. The Duke of York had also been there, about the future, the role for the Duke of York, and what that might look like, what the Queen's wishes were, but also how Charles will handle this. And as for his son Harry, well, by coincidence, he was in the country at this moment. But it is notable that he didn't fly with other members of the royal family. There may be a purely practical reason for that, but he flew alone. He got there after the death of the Queen, and he left early this morning. And I don't think until this moment we've seen any kind of signs of reconciliation between them. Charles's people say, well, he always has an open invitation to them. But I think there's a lack of trust. And what now unfolds, we will have to wait and see, because the stakes have got a huge deal higher.
Sarah, for those of us who may have just joined us in the last little while, talk to us again about what we know about the Queen's final hours, who was able to make it to her bedside, and who arrived after her death.
Yes, Libby, I think what is quite special here in some ways is that the Queen was able to spend her final weeks in a very, very important place to her, Balmoral, up in the Scottish Highlands. It was very dear to her late father and became very dear to her and Prince Philip as well. It is actually the place where they got engaged, and it is, according to their granddaughter, Princess Eugenie, the place they were at their happiest. She said they absolutely loved it there, surrounded by dogs. They would be woken by a lone piper beneath the window of their bedroom in Balmoral Castle every day. And so for the Queen to have her final days and hours there is very special and will give great comfort to those who are mourning her at the moment. She had had many visits over the course of the summer from members of the royal family, including the Cambridge family, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and their children. the Prince of Wales, the Duke of York. And on the day of her death, Prince Charles, as he was, King Charles, as we now have to get used to calling him, was in Scotland. He was at another house, Dumfries House in Ayrshire. He was travelled by helicopter to be with his mother. He was there. Princess Anne also was in Scotland on engagements, so she was there. But the remaining members of the royal family, the Queen's two sons, Andrew and Edward, her grandson, Prince William, they flew up on an RAF military jet, but they didn't make it there in time, and nor did Prince Harry. They were, though, able to come together as a family after that. And I think that there will have been a degree of shutting themselves away just for that night last night before returning here. And as we saw, King Charles coming here to face what is his destiny, his future now, well, actually his present. He is now the monarch.
Yeah, Sarah, one does wonder and reflect on what that night was like for them. And you make such an important point that it was sort of the calm before the storm, and they could have that privacy. And if they chose time together as a family to process their great loss and prepare for the intense public scrutiny and focus that is to come. You know, here in the States, home to Harry and Meghan, many people view them very fondly. They find them to be electric and youthful and exciting. But the British press has been savage to them. So what is this return and homecoming like for that couple? Oh, I think we just lost the signal, so I'll turn that question to Hannah Jewell. Hannah, you were at the wedding of Meghan and Harry, and even in the short time since then, the public perception has really changed. And of course, we have to remember who this is led by, right? Is this the public leading, or is it the press, which has an agenda leading in the UK, and the public is sort of, you know, being batted about as they watch some of these intense criticisms and rivalries played out in the British press, which is very different than the American press?
I remember wondering this in 2018 as there was this sort of fairy tale moment, a royal wedding that, of course, British press loves. I remember wondering how long it might be before the whole system, the sort of nature of the sort of the control of the royal family over its members, all of this would sort of get to Meghan Markle, now the Duchess of Sussex, given her fundamental Americanness, right? And having gone from being this you know, independent, this actor, she had a lifestyle brand in that world, being obviously a lot of press attention as an actor, and then as the sort of date of Prince Harry. But how much it's hard to overstate how horrible the British press can be to those it has turned against. You have seen these really obvious sort of contrasts between the way that particularly Meghan, as a biracial woman, has been treated compared to Kate. Things as simple as images of Meghan keeping her hands on her belly when she was pregnant was sort of shown as being like showy or fake, versus the same stories being written about Kate as how wonderful and maternal. Things like this. And it's an interesting thing when we analyze this element of drama in the royal family. How much is it people like to pin things on Meghan, and I think that kind of overlooks the agency that Harry himself has, and it's something that he has spoken about, how their decision to, you know, abdicate, not really abdicate, but abdicate to California, was driven by what he saw and his anger at the British press for their hounding of his mother, what that did to her mental health, how stifled she was in the palace and controlled, him beginning to see that happening to his wife. And, you know, it's not as if he could have gone to California without his own consent. I think that he made a decision to sort of protect his family from all of that, because I don't think anyone can understand until they're in it what it actually means to be a royal. Obviously, the luxury, the privilege, all of this, but also having lost all sense of control of your own life to the point of what nail varnish color you can wear. I think that it's such an interesting thing to see the legacy of Diana shaping that continued, drama seems like a crass word to describe this situation, this fallout. It's not just two brothers fighting. There's something deeper to it there. Whether or not there will be this, like, the longed for reconciliation, I don't think at least British tabloid press is necessarily eager for that. They have a punching bag in Harry and Meghan that they would be loath to give up, I think. And you can see whatever events happen in the royal family that tabloids can sort of spin to blame on this couple, and particularly on Meghan, is sort of an incredibly rapid decline from that moment in 2018, where it was about how sort of lovely everything was. There was this romance and this magic of this wedding, to the sort of grim reality of what it means to be a royal in Britain, particularly one on the wrong side of the press.
Sarah Hewson, can you talk more about just what the expectations are on Harry and Meghan in this moment, and if they can come to this moment as authentic people, or if they still will be sort of bound by and controlled by the protocol and the routine and the expectations put on the royal family?
I think what will be really interesting is the kind of public reception they get now after the death of the Queen, because there is a sadness that the final months of the Queen's life were very difficult. In many ways, as a result of family troubles, the scandal surrounding the Duke of York and his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and Harry and Meghan, and that interview on Oprah Winfrey, and the claims that were made about a member of the royal family making a racist remark, for example, hugely damaging to the monarchy. And the Queen, I think, always took a pragmatic view that this would play out over time, and that in time the family might come back together, that the noise around this would stop and they would come back together. And she has always made it clear that Harry and Meghan remained very much loved members of the family. But I wonder what the British public reaction will be to them now after the Queen's death. They were in Manchester on Monday in the north of England, attending an event for One Young World. Meghan gave a speech there. Some of the headlines were not kind, as you have described in the aftermath of that speech. She's had her podcast out, and she's talked a little bit about the way in which she was received in Britain, and she suggested that perhaps, is this because I'm an American? And I think there is a British stiff upper lip mentality, and the royal family never complain, never explain. And Meghan, someone much more open, someone much more prepared to talk about what her experiences are, and that doesn't always sit easily here with some. And the media, you are right, has taken a different approach to the Duchess of Cambridge as to Meghan, and you can compare comparable events and see a very different take on it. And we know that Prince Harry and Meghan have had a very tough time with the media, but there is also a great degree of sadness that a family has fallen apart in this way, and that two brothers who were once so very close are now miles and miles apart. Highlighted last weekend when they were both just a short distance away, 300 metres apart from each other on the Windsor estate in their respective homes, and yet didn't see each other. So I think there will be a sense of hope now that this moment could be a moment for change and really propel them to sort this out.
Sarah, how much of this has to do with duty and responsibility, and the responsibility now on William and how he perceives his role in the family?
Well, that's always been the difference, hasn't it, between William and Harry. One knew that he would succeed to the throne at some stage. The other was the spare, effectively. And that was a difficult role for Harry to carve out, while it also gave him greater freedoms. There's a huge amount of responsibility now on William's shoulders, as he will, in the not too distant future, become the Prince of Wales, taking on his father's title. And I think we will see him in a very prominent role supporting his father, and he is having to rise to that challenge pretty rapidly. He's known it's coming, but nothing really could ease that transition other than just getting on with it. And he's been watching his father, he's been watching his grandmother. He's a man who knows his own mind, and he will know how he wants the future of the monarchy to look, because what his father does is really important now to the monarchy and the nation that he will inherit. And I think we will see him having a great degree of input into that.
Mary Jordan, what is the role of all of these other family members around Charles when we look at William and Harry and what their roles are here, not just literally in terms of succession or sort of being out very far down the line of succession, but as they support Charles III as king? Does their duty and responsibility to him change?
Yes, I think quite a lot changes. Queen Elizabeth talked about her relationship with her own sister. She was so close to Margaret. And it changed because she all of a sudden had a new role. She wasn't just her sister, but she had to enforce the rules as she saw it to continue the good name of the monarchy. So I think a lot will change. But you bring up a really important question because many people are expecting
and for making ABC News
King Charles to slim down the royals. You know, there's a lot of cousins and you know, I mean, how far when you get the tree do you go, and how many perks should they have? One of the ways to modernize and very importantly to slim down costs is that you will see a tighter focus on the family, and so that there's not what they call the grace and favor perks for a wider group of people. When Princess Diana came to Washington, it was not long right before she died. She was here visiting the former owner of the Washington Post, Katharine Graham. And Katharine Graham had a big party for Princess Diana. And I was standing there, and Barbara Walters was also there. And she said to Princess Diana, you know, I was at your wedding, and I remember all those lesser royals. And Diana went, oh my, she just kind of flinched at her whole body, and she said, oh, the lesser royals. I hate that term. But it was this moment where, you know, there's quite a lot of them, and it'll be very interesting to see if he puts his foot down and says, you know, we have a lot of lands, we have a lot of palaces, we have a lot of places everywhere, and we really need to trim back. So I think stay tuned on that point. It's a really good one.
To be on a fly on the wall, Mary, and to have been with you through some of those experiences you've had. I can't wait to hear more about them over the coming days during our coverage. It's just so fascinating. Sarah Houston, I want to go back to you to talk a little bit more about the relationship of Charles with his family and how it changes. I mean, one of the things that was to take place was that family members, if I have this correct, would be kissing the hand of Charles when his mother passed, sort of elevating and showing the relationship and the change of his status and importance in succession.
Yes, according to tradition, family members who were there at the moment that he became king would kiss his hand. So we know that his sister, Princess Anne, was there at the same time. Whether it happened, we don't know. We also have the kissing hand ceremony when you have one prime minister appointed by the Queen. And actually, nowadays, it doesn't involve the actual kissing of hands. It involves a handshake and either a bow or a curtsy. We won't know what went on in that room, but I think this changes the dynamics of the family hugely, because rather than 4 children of the monarch, we now have a monarch and his 3 siblings. The line of succession changes. It is enormous for Charles, but it is also very big for his siblings as well, who will have to step up even further to support him. They've also lost their mother, and this is a moment of national mourning, but it is also a family grieving as well. And it is family that are going to have to grieve in a very public forum, because over the course of the coming days and into next week and beyond to Monday the 19th of September, when we expect the funeral to take place, the nation will be looking to them. After the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, I was in Windsor, and the Earl and Countess of Wessex came out. They'd just been to visit the Queen to pay their condolences, and the Countess of Wessex wound down her window and was talking to people there who'd gathered, who stopped to talk to the media and told us that the Queen was amazing, quite remarkable. And they also went to church, and they came out and spoke to the well-wishers there. We've seen the King do it here outside Buckingham Palace, but I think over the course of the coming days we may well see other members of the family coming out and making themselves publicly visible, even in their time of great private grief, because that is their duty. This is no ordinary family, is it?
Sarah, you were covering Prime Minister Liz Truss's visit up to Balmoral Castle earlier this week. Tell us about those last moments we witnessed in the Queen's public life.
I think this is really quite significant and important. The Queen's health was obviously fading, and she may well have been advised that she could pass on that duty to her heir, the Prince of Wales, Charles, now King Charles. But she was very much determined that she would do that and carry out that very key constitutional role, transferring power from one Prime Minister to the next, from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss. And we had these beautiful images, I think, of the Queen standing in the drawing room at Balmoral Castle, wearing her tartan skirt and a cardigan and a huge smile on her face. And to be honest, she looked like everybody's grandmother. There were no robes, there was no formality about this, even though it was a very formal duty. And she looked very happy. And I think for her to have gone out with such dignity, doing the job that she was born to do, the job that on her 21st birthday she swore that she would do for her whole life, whether it be long or short, and she would devote herself to that duty. And she did, right up until the end, carrying out that very important role just 2 days before the end of her life. And she's very proud, she was a very dignified woman. She would not have wanted to be seen fading. She didn't want to be seen in a wheelchair. She didn't want the public to see her looking frail, and she did look frail, but she looked happy and dignified, and I think that was really important to her.
Sarah Hewson, live outside of Buckingham Palace. Thank you so much, and Sarah will continue to join us over the coming days of coverage. We are so grateful for your insights and time, Sarah. Mary Jordan, I want to go to you on these last months of the Queen's life and her celebration of the Platinum Jubilee, and then also the preparations that she was able to do to take some concrete steps to prepare for the next generation. Everything from ensuring how Camilla would be described and sort of categorized as the future Queen Consort, to also helping her son prepare for his inevitable role.
I think that showed her wisdom. She knew that if people said, the Queen said this was okay, in Camilla's case, that was key. If the Queen said, you know, Prince Andrew has, made a mistake and he's going to take the consequences and have things stripped, but I'm going to walk with him, that showed that he's still going to be there. He still is in the immediate family, but yet there'll be no money from the government paying for things that he does. She knew, and that's why she was doing so many things at the end. It was like very important housekeeping, because she knew that her son is going to have challenges. And he could always, at least in what could be a rocky transitions, people would know, hey, that wasn't really Charles, that was the Queen's wish. And I think that the part about insisting that she be there for the new Prime Minister 2 days before she died was vintage Queen Elizabeth. She didn't like her job when it started, but I think she really did like her job in the end. I think she had some satisfaction that she had done it well, and that she was so doubtful, so self-deprecating, you know, and people didn't help by saying, who is this young woman who doesn't know that much, being the head of state? She came, people have said that I talked to who worked directly with her, that she said, you know, maybe I wasn't so bad at that. And that's pretty good satisfaction as you head out the door. Wouldn't it be lovely for all of us to go out this way? Her father suffered terribly from lung disease. She is the woman who wanted to be in the James Bond movie, and she kind of had a James Bond ending here.
Mary, what does it mean to prepare to be king? You know, you talk about how the Queen was able to grow into the role and not just flourish in that role, but learn to love it and learn to find a way to navigate it that she loved. What does it mean to prepare to be king?
I think, again, it is Prince Charles, when he was Prince Charles all those years, knew the problems with that job. You know, he was constantly criticized. He was under the microscope. He was bullied at school. You know, he talked about and wrote about how they threw pillows at him and they threw slippers at the wall and they kind of mocked him like, oh, you just have this job because of who your mommy is. So he knew the bad parts. Becoming king now is kind of taking hold of what could be the influential and the good parts. I think we've seen a whole years and years of what really drives Prince Charles. He often talks, whether it's about fishing and sustainable farming and, you know, climate change, it's the conditions of living. He says he wants to improve people's conditions of living. When he was criticized for speaking out and getting political as a member of the royal family, he said, I know I'm not supposed to, but I'm doing it because it's about people's lives and I want to make them better. So now he's king and he has some power, and it's going to be really interesting how he uses this amazing platform, amazing global platform, to do what he's been more quietly doing in the shadow of Queen Elizabeth.
It is exactly noon here on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., where Mary and I are. 5 o'clock in London and Buckingham Palace. You see that live image there. And we are expecting a pre-taped speech coming from King Charles in about an hour. And we will wait to see what the new king has to say. The Ascension ceremony has not yet taken place, but Mary, he became king the moment his mother died. I'm curious, Mary, to hear from you what this moment means for the preparation of his children and how, you know, William and Kate now have to think about preparing their children, because there sort of seemed like this insurmountable hurdle of the Queen and her longevity that stood between them and the throne, and now suddenly that's just been so compressed, and it almost seems to be right around the corner in some way.
Oh, for sure. You know, it's a difference between being in the dugout and being, you know, next up to bat. You start getting nervous. You start swinging the bat. And I think they're obviously know that this was coming and then certainly been preparing for it, but now it's getting real. Prince Charles is only 73, but we certainly know that things can happen. Queen Elizabeth has some pretty mighty genes. Her mother lived to 101. She lived to 96. But we don't know where what will happen with Prince Charles. And so they must be both excited, nervous. They have 3 children. let's just hope that those 3 children, you know, that I think that we'll be seeing Harry and Meghan's 2 children, Lilibet and Archie. And I think that they're going to probably have many years before they have to take over. I think now is the time, and it does come at funerals and weddings and big events, especially now when the 2 brothers live so far apart, that there is a chance with this long rollout and the ceremonies, and maybe something good will happen. You know, if you're religious as the Queen Elizabeth was, she often talked about how she prayed. She's going to have a big presence over that in some way, and maybe some of it is to unite this family that, you know, has been through a hell of a lot.
Mary Jordan, correspondent for The Washington Post. Mary, I am looking forward over the coming days to hearing more of your stories about Princess Diana and beyond. So thank you so much for talking with us. Hannah Jewell, let's go to you on the line of succession and just how this works. Because as we were just hearing from Mary, you know, there was this, you know, difference of being in the dugout versus being kind of getting ready to get at bat. So talk us through how the line of succession works and how it's changed even over the last few years.
So I can't keep putting it in baseball terms, unfortunately. I don't have that vocabulary under my wraps, but certainly the dugout has moved up one notch. That's not right. We see for the first time in 70 years that there is a change, that there is everyone is moving up one in the line of succession to the throne. And we have a graphic actually sort of showing how this works. The way this works is not by age or seniority, really, but it goes down the line of the eldest child. So you have the Queen having passed away, you have Charles now as King Charles. You see there his former wife Diana and current wife Camilla. From there it goes, it basically surpasses his 2 siblings, or rather 3. To Prince William is now the first in line to the throne, and Prince George, who is 9 years old. You see how the children supplant Harry and his heirs in this line. And actually, it wasn't until 2013 that the royal family ended male preference primogeniture. So meaning that had Charlotte been born before George, her brother, she would have been next in line. Whereas you saw in previous generations, or 2 generations previous to them, Andrew, the Duke of York, was in the line of succession despite being younger than Princess Anne, due to that rule, which only changed quite recently. Then you have just a lot of sort of babies in the line here before you come back to Harry, and then Harry's children. After that, you then get back to the 2 generations previously, the Duke of York, his eldest daughter, Princess Beatrice, and then her eldest child, Sienna Elizabeth. So you see the things only really change in the event of, you know, new births. If William and Kate were to have another child, this would knock everyone below them down another rung. But as you see the children sort of supplant their uncles and aunts and their cousins and so on, the only other really way this can change is in the event of an abdication, which is how the late Queen's father, George VI, became king after the abdication of her uncle, Edward VIII, which happened in 1936 and set off a sort of constitutional crisis. It might not have seemed clear in that time. This was such a huge disruptive moment that the monarchy would survive nearly a century later to this point. But you see sort of how this line now is so much closer suddenly just this week to a 9-year-old boy being only 2 seats away from the throne. So I'm going to send it back to James in the studio. James, I'm curious if you think, as everyone is wondering and sort of in the back of people's minds this week, whether William and Harry will reconcile, whether this series of events today will offer them that opportunity.
Yeah, you know, like any family, Hannah, deaths can bring people closer together, or they can deepen divisions. And you know, I think that lack of trust, as Sarah put it a few minutes ago, really is a very serious. It's hard to overstate the damage that Oprah interview did when Harry told Oprah that members of his family didn't want him to marry Meghan and suggested it was because of the color of her skin, and that they asked what their children would look like. But when you think about dynastic tensions, literally, there's nothing more than the royal family where that comes into play. But these kinds of brother against brother tensions are so central to not just British history, but literally the Bible and Shakespeare. And the Harry and William story sometimes feels like it could be in great literature. You think to Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his 11 brothers and Moses, Aaron and Miriam and Peter and Andrew in the Bible. But there also there's a lot of Shakespeare tension between brothers. And in Henry IV, Part 1, Prince John of Lancaster does his royal duty while his brother, Prince Hal, lives it up in the East Cheap Tavern. And in a lot of ways, they're really, when you look at Henry IV, there are similarities between Prince John and Prince William and Prince Hal and Prince Harry. And so these tensions are so endemic in any family where there's an heir and a spare. And as you noted, Hannah, it's really true that now a 9-year-old boy is second in line to the throne, but the British have rules and regulations. So in theory, he could become the king if something happened to his father and grandfather, but Prince George wouldn't be able to exercise his royal duties until he becomes an adult by turning 18. Hannah?
It's interesting reporting this week, James, from the US, and many of us will be in the UK shortly, on these issues from the distance of, being Americans who can view these people as sort of distant celebrities with an air of glamour and everything, can view the sibling rivalries as sort of drama. I'm curious if you think that Americans would view the royal family differently if, this is getting way back, 1776, if they were indeed our royal family still. Do you think that there's more space to sort of admire and follow the royals as Americans?
Yeah, very much. And because we can really look at this like it's reality television. And I think in some ways we can be more enchanted by the royal family because we're not paying for it. I think about all the things, you hear, we spend a lot of time out talking to voters who get angry about wastes of taxpayer money. And we're not paying for the royal allowances, as Mary Jordan was talking about, for these lesser royals. And so I think it can be sort of amusing to us. And now there is enough distance that, 1776 we're actually coming up on the 250th anniversary in the next couple of years of our independence. And so it's not the same, it's not as raw as I think it was even in the 1930s before World War II, when that special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom really became special.
Hannah, I'm so curious about how much succession is on the minds of people in the UK and how much, is this something you are British, is this something that every school child in the UK grows up knowing, the line of succession, or are they puzzling through all this just as we are?
Growing up British, but in the American school system for most of my childhood, where I think that one thing that, British kids have to learn so much royal history that only kind of comes up in American education when it's coming to the American Revolution, right? But it is certainly something that is such a huge part of British education and culturally following all these figures, not necessarily that people can rattle off like who's number 7 versus who's number 8, but sort of putting them in their minds in order of importance culturally, in order of how much scrutiny they get from the media according to how far they are up this pecking order. And it's just sort of interesting to see that play out, and how we do now have 3 male heirs after this 70-year reign of a woman, and with no real potential, unless Prince George, has a daughter for another queen for some time, and also how sort of strange it is to be peering into the private lives of this family and of a child in particular to look for an heir. It feels very, again, literally medieval, biblical, as far back as we've had royal families.
Let's go to Lewis Goodall, an analyst and investigations editor for the Global News in London. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm interested to hear from you how this first week has been. What a strange and memorable week for Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister. Tell us about this.
Well, absolutely, Libby. I mean, we've got to remember that the Queen had 15 Prime Ministers. Boris Johnson was her 14th Prime Minister up until Tuesday, and Liz Truss became her 15th on Tuesday. And there were a couple of images that were released of so-called kissing hands when the Prime Minister goes and becomes appointed by the Queen. It had never happened at Balmoral before in Scotland. Typically, this happens either at Windsor or at Buckingham Palace. But such was, we were told, the Queen's mobility issues that she had, that for the first time, the outgoing Prime Minister and incoming Prime Minister went to Scotland. And of course, those were the last images we ever saw of her alive. It was an extraordinary, just as a human, I suppose, just an extraordinary experience for Liz Truss to have. She comes back down to London. She makes her first speech as Prime Minister outside 10 Downing Street. And the next day, she's due to be making a big intervention on what's going to happen to energy prices in the UK, which have been skyrocketing. And we were all saying, people like me were going on the television and so on and saying, look, this is the big moment, the biggest moment for the Liz Truss premiership. If she doesn't get this right on Thursday, that is it, game over. And yet there we were watching the House of Commons. She was making that speech, and suddenly we saw little bits of paper being passed up and down the Commons, both to her and to her opposite number, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. And suddenly their faces went ashen. And we all in the press gallery started talking about it and speculating, and we all kind of knew what it was, that it must be the Queen. And then she has to, later that evening, go only on her second full day as Prime Minister, address the nation and try and articulate some of the sorrow and unease that a nation who literally had not changed monarch for 70 years was now feeling. It's quite a responsibility.
It's hard to imagine and so memorable. We've had some of our guests observe that this could be an incredible sort of bonding moment and connection between King Charles and Prime Minister Truss, because they are both entering this strange and challenging new world simultaneously. What will you be watching in terms of their relationship and this perhaps unique bond that they're forming in this moment?
Well, look, first things first, it is extraordinary that this has happened in the same week. You have to go all the way back to 1830 in the UK to find a Prime Minister and a sovereign, a monarch, changing in the same year, let alone the same week. And that was William IV and the Duke of Wellington. So, this is just extraordinary. It is, of course, possible. Look, these are two people who are not ingenues in politics, in British politics, right? So you've got Charles has had the longest apprenticeship in British history. He's 73 years of age. He's the oldest monarch. Again, William IV was actually the oldest monarch before him to become the king. So he keeps popping up a lot. But he's the oldest monarch. So he has had a long time to prepare for this moment. Liz Truss, likewise, has not come from nowhere. She was a foreign secretary. She's been a senior cabinet minister for some time. So we're talking about experienced people. But yeah, of course, they're going to have a unique bond. The Prime Minister, she's already met him today for their first audience, and both of them are going to have to try and find their way. But it is extraordinary to consider that at the start of this week, Britain had one monarch and one Prime Minister, and by the end of the week, both have changed. It's remarkable.
Talk to us about the Queen and her prime ministers. Winston Churchill was her first, and just looking at the images of them back in that era, it's just, Lewis, it's just such truly a different world when you look at that young Queen Elizabeth and Winston Churchill, truly from a different era. Tell us about those relationships over time.
Yeah, like I said, it is extraordinary. She had 15 prime ministers. When you consider that her first prime minister, Winston Churchill, was born in, I think, 1875. Liz Truss, her last prime minister, was born in 1974. So you literally have a century of time passed between these prime ministers. And, when you consider the Queen's life, and I think this is in the end why she was, it was an extraordinary life and why she had such a unique relationship, not just with Britain, but the world. She embodied a different era. She was the last link for Britain, but also for the world, of a gone era, of the era of the Second World War. And because she had known all of these people, whether it was Churchill or Clement Attlee or Harold Wilson or Harold Macmillan and all of these sorts of people who to, people like me and people much older than me are figures from history, or in an American case, knowing people like Truman or Kennedy or Eisenhower, it allowed us to feel that visceral link with our own past, right? She embodied it, and now she's gone. But her relationship with those prime ministers, all of them, the remarkable thing in many ways, and they were all very different people, those 15 people, and yet all of them never had not only a bad word to say about her, but seemed to genuinely relish the relationship. Watching the House of Commons today with Theresa May talking about her, for example, of Boris Johnson, they always said the same thing. Those weekly meetings that you had were the only time when you could genuinely sort of let rip, and you knew that nothing was going to leave or leak from that meeting. A lot of prime ministers, really interesting to consider, a lot of prime ministers often talk about it almost like as a sort of psychotherapy kind of role. They could go into Buckingham Palace and just say, oh my God, I've had a hell of a week. And it was a very informal kind of chat. And the whole point of those, there's no real reason for those meetings to happen. But they all drew on her very long experience. And, they would occasionally say things like, oh, I'm having this problem with a world leader. And then she would say, oh, I knew their father, And so that kind of depth of experience is just irreplaceable. But of course, but of course, that new relationship, as we say, between Truss and now King Charles will have to be forged. And he will have to forge his own relationship with his prime ministers in the years to come.
Finally, Lewis, give us a sense of the scale of this era-defining moment for the British people.
Well, like I say, I think the reason why, look, for a start, if you consider the first half of the 20th century, it was not unusual for the population wouldn't have found it unusual for the king or queen to change, right? Winston Churchill, actually, in the 1952 accession debate, when the queen came to the throne, he remarked to the Commons that I have seen 4 kings come and go since I've been an MP. It's totally different now. They'd had kings or Queen Victoria died in 1901. Edward VII died in 1910. George V died in 1936, and George VI died in 1952. It was sort of commonplace. People just got used to it. It was part of life. None of us have had that. She has been this element of stability in not only a dramatic period for Britain, but an epochal change of one for Britain, right? It goes from this hyper-imperial power to a very different sort of country. And yet throughout, she was there as this sort of North Star in the sky, and she's not gone. And so it is a big psychological blow. And even saying the words thing like the king is doing this, no one had said that in Britain for 70 years. The king is doing this. That is just a psychological change. And look, life will go on. We shouldn't be too dramatic about these things. Of course, life will go on. But I think there's an awareness that, nothing will be quite the same. And, there will be a long period of gratitude, I think, for, even if you don't necessarily believe in the monarchy or whatever, that she did that job pretty much as well as anyone could possibly expect anyone to do it.
Lewis Goodall, analysis and investigations editor for Global News in London. He's also co-host of the podcast, The News Agents. Thank you so much, Lewis. Really appreciate your time. Hannah Jewell, this idea of the Queen as North Star is, it's very poetic. But the thing about the North Star is you always know where it is. You can always find it. And even if you're not someone who perhaps is romantic about the monarchy, is this still a sense of loss and change for people who might even be Republicans and sort of anti-monarchy, or might even be people who chafe at that structure and old ritual, but still are just so used to her being there?
Oh, of course, just enormously disruptive. There's no escaping it, no matter your feelings about monarchy in Britain, right? There's so much changing, so much about to change, from the money to the national anthem to also the inescapable public ceremonies that we're going to see over this next week or so. I think that you have stuff being canceled. You have from media, television, and so on, to sort of certain businesses, activities. A big carnival that was planned in Hackney shutting down because of this, which people have mixed feelings about. You have at every level of life, this is a huge change, and just the weirdness of British people talking about the fundamental strangeness of saying King Charles instead of the Queen, as at least among millennials, as their parents and their grandparents said. That change is going to fundamentally rock people, even when they say that they don't care or it doesn't affect them or so on. Of course it does.
Washington Post opinions editor Autumn Brewington is the author of a new newsletter for the Washington Post on the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, and she joins me now. Autumn, what is your focus today here as we start to mark this first full day without Queen Elizabeth II?
Today is really about seeing how Charles leads. It was really interesting that, immediately upon arriving in London, he got out of the car and he greeted people, and we saw him, interacting with that crowd. Obviously, people who are gathering outside of Buckingham Palace are likely to be supporters of the monarchy or people who are really sympathetic to the royal family. But I thought it was quite interesting how many people were, sounding tearful as they said, "Long live the king," and just expressed, their feelings to him. One woman kissed him, didn't seem like she asked permission, So he was greeted very positively. And, for a person who for a long time has had, kind of questions swirling around him of how would people react to him as king when he's not as, universally popular as his mother was, that was probably a really big boost.
Autumn, let's watch some of the footage from the Washington Post. This is from mourners this morning outside of Buckingham Palace.
I was talking to my sister just now. She called me to sympathise because she knew I was upset about the death of the Queen so soon after the death of my mother, who absolutely adored the Queen, the royal family, and what she stood for, and her love of horses. My mother, all her life, rode horses. She raced. She won the first ladies' race in Kuala Lumpur in 1952. My father met the Queen in Nairobi and afterwards when he was in the army. And for me, it brought everything back about my mum just dying, and huge respect for the Queen and everything she stood for.
One of the mourners the Washington Post spoke to outside of Buckingham Palace today. Autumn, you get the sense there of people seeing the Queen's death in a very personal light, both because of their family connections, but also because of what's going on in their own lives. I mean, it reminds me much of when the way Diana died, that it was really almost not just the loss of that individual, but also the loss of whatever that meant in your life. The loss of a dream, the loss of a symbol, the loss of youth, the loss of promise. It means even more than the individual.
I think that's totally true. And I thought it was really interesting in London a couple of weeks ago. I was standing outside Kensington Palace the weekend before the 25th anniversary of Diana's death. And already people were putting up photos and banners and saying, we come every year, we come on her birthday, and we come on this anniversary because she just meant so much to us. I think one of the Post columnists, Monica Hess, had written either yesterday or today in, sort of complimenting how the Queen had done her job. The Queen was, something you could count on. Like, she was such a constant in life, like death and taxes. She was always there. You always knew, she was reliable. She could be counted on. And so many people, I think, are just sort of expressing the loss of that presence that was so familiar.
Talk to us about the evolution of the Queen, Autumn, from a young princess into a grandmother figure and leader for the nation.
And it is really such an extraordinary thing. You sort of hear that quote that's been going around on social media over the past day and a half, how her first prime minister was born in 1874 and her most recent prime minister was born in 1975. But when you think about just sort of the arc of the Queen's reign, she comes to the throne at age 25. She's a young mother of, 2. She was so glamorous, in the ball gowns, and just it was sort of this, kind of wonderful image for a country, coming still out of World War II and kind of regaining its footing. Like, she just seemed, such this glamorous young queen. And then over the years, she really, grew into the job, but also grew through her life. And in, the 60s and 70s, you kind of see her go through, she's entered into sort of more middle age. And then you had kind of the Diana era, and Diana and Fergie, and then William and Harry. And like, you sort of see the younger generations kind of catching popular imagination. But I think one thing that was sort of really interesting how Queen Elizabeth II came to be seen as a sort of grandmother of the nation figure was really after her own mother passed. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, passed away in 2001. Then all of a sudden, I think the Queen, who had been in a space between sort of, her early years as such a glamorous figure, and then as she was getting older, then she kind of really had the space in the popular imagination to be sort of that grandmother role for the nation.
We're looking at images from outside Buckingham Palace. Hannah Jewell, as we think about Queen Elizabeth, I mean, many of us do think about the last years of her life and that image of almost the grandmother type. But how much is the Queen Elizabeth of earlier decades on the mind of people in the United Kingdom as they think about her legacy and what she leaves behind?
Well, as we were just hearing, she just was so young when she took the throne in her 20s, and you kind of can see almost this arc maybe of the way that human beings feel about women at different ages of their lives. You have the sort of celebrated young glamour. You have the sort of middle-aged years where is when she had her bad years, dealing with the fallout, the divorces of her children, the scandals and so on. Less warm feelings, lower public polling about the royal family and the Queen specifically, and then you see her emerge into these elder years of becoming then sort of beloved grandmother figure, and there's this arc in this life, which I think that is the one, the elder years, because she has lived so long, has been, this grandmother age for the vast majority of what most people remember who are alive in Britain today. I think that is the image that will last on longer, more so than the earlier times, and I think that's probably what the royal family, those who work and try to control this image, would prefer. Of course, it's going to be strange to go, Charles, not a young man, but in his 70s, to sort of revert back to a patriarch in the most literal, fundamental sense of that, and how different that feels to the sort of the feminized monarch, and the idea of having this grandmother figure. Will there be that sort of same familiar tone, or will it be more sort of jarring to have a king? Libby?
Yeah, James, it is so interesting to think of that, the patrimonial, the patriarchal image of Charles, because up till now he's really been the subordinate, right? And he's sort of captured in our minds as the subordinate, and that symbolized in many different ways. And so will the public be able to see him now in this new role, not just as leader, but as almost father figure of the nation?
They're going to have to, but it will be a transition. For those of us who watched The Crown, the image we have of Charles as a petulant young man, dealing with being sent to boarding school, which he himself in real life has talked about, how his parents were distant and he was sent to this Scottish boarding school that emphasized privation as a way to build character. And so he grew up obviously in lavish luxury, but also with a mother and a father who were quite distant, and all of his challenges with Diana, and on and on and on. And now he's a 73-year-old man, and it is, we talk about how that's pretty old, but that is 5 years younger than our our president and former president. And it also is, if he lives as long as his mother, he could potentially have a 23-year-long reign.
And his father lived to 99.
And his father lived to 99. He does have good genes on both sides. So he could be king for another 2 decades. And, he's someone who has been in good health. He survived. He was one of the first people, he was one of the very first world leaders to get COVID back in early 2020. And he survived. Before vaccines or anything like that. So we don't know how long he's going